Okay. Live now.
Take two. Welcome to the bleeding edge of IP communications. This is the VUC. We're located at VUC.me. As usual, our thanks go out to Simwood.com. Simwood can turn any developer into a telco. Our hosted telephony is from OnSIP.com. Where would we be without ZipDX.com for our wideband, full-featured audio conferencing system? The VUC.me website is on Bluehost.com. And our local rate dial-ins are from Voxbone.com. Sounds like a .com revolution to me. So here's one more. TAD. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the VUC edition 509. Just imagine, if you will, doing 509 sessions of the VUC, because we've done that. And now I want to explain a little bit about what is VUC Visions. While VUC Visions is when somebody cancels 3 days before they were supposed to show up, we assemble a panel of really great personalities. And I'm going to introduce, first of all, I have to show myself. I'm going to introduce, because I see him on my screen, Mr. who everyone knows. And
hello, Randy. Good to be here. I don't know that everybody knows me. Some people know me.
When was your last appearance on CNN? That goes back a few years already, right?
That was a few years back, yes. I work, I've been part of the VUC world for, 5-6 years now, something, showing up from time to time to talk about SIP and security and odds and ends and IPv6. And last time I was on here, I think I was talking about DNSSEC. My big job is with the Internet Society and focused around helping get IPv6, DNSSEC, and other Internet technologies more widely deployed.
And as your name is Dan York, it's understandable that your Twitter handle is @Dan and you're on Hello, you're on Google+, you're on...
Yeah. Those. Part of my job is to chase bright, shiny objects and then write about them and figure out how they work. So that's what I do. And in this context, I've been writing about stuff here and promoting things through my Disruptive Telephony blog for a while. Exactly.
I was going to try to get to that. So Disruptive Telephony, and you've got like 16 other URLs, but we probably don't have.
Yeah, we don't care about those right now.
Yes, we do. Tim Patton has been a regular. We were just talking about that. You've been around for a while, Tim. You're almost in my time zone. You're over in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, I'm in the UK. It's getting dark here, which is sad, but hey, whatever. So I'm kind of been, I think last time I was on the VUC, we were talking about iStun and Turn and the low-level network stuff. And I kind of think this is interesting in that it enables a set of stuff that solves some problems in things like, well, in this kind of stuff, in the person-to-person video world, but also I think in the Internet of Things world. And I'm increasingly interested in how my fridge is going to talk to my solar panels. I think this is actually really important and difficult. So not only that, but I think it's important we work out how I should talk to my parrot from a distance.
And we'll get to that shortly. And of course, we're going to get to, so we're talking IPv6, we're talking IoT, Internet of Things, and those two things are very closely linked. But we're also going to be talking about TMoL, that'll be at the end, and of course, WebRTC, which you're a major player in, Tim. Also, speaking of WebRTC, Emil Ivav, who's here with us, he's in my country, Brian?
Yes, I am currently in Strasbourg, France. I am. It's actually still light here. I don't know how that's possible if in Britain it's already dark. I'm interested in how to stop talking to my fridge in general, or at least talk less to my fridge. Last time I was here, it was actually with Tim on the same topic, and NAT reversal, which was a topic back then, is a really interesting subject to me. And obviously IPv6 is one of the not traversal techniques, falls into that category. I found it very interesting how through the past 15, 20 years, people have had IPv6, which is the solution that makes sense, and still managed to get around with deploying it by actually inventing a number of other techniques. I think this is a very good proof of how the world works, actually. And I'm very happy to be here today on VUC Visions. So I'm very happy that someone canceled, because we're going to have a super discussion on all these things.
We are, and you're too modest because we need to say JITSI, JITSI.org for all things Jitsi. We are talking on Jitsi Video Bridge right now. And Emil, of course, has been involved with the client, famous SIP client, for a long time. Andy Smith is with us. Andy, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself or have any URLs, but...
Well, for me, these sort of things, you're not expecting me to say nothing, are you?
No.
But these sort of things are absolutely vital. I mean, I have much the same interests in this that Emil's just been talking about. I mean, from my perspective, I'm more concerned with what happens with the average person who's got the average router that's given out by the average ITSP when everything is IPv6 enabled and we're talking to individual devices. I mean, what are the security problems there? Are we making loads and loads of trouble for ourselves? So, yeah, that sort of area of discussion particularly interests me.
And I have to agree with you there, and also say that I've been on IPv. Our provider has been doing IPv6 for years here in France, and I still don't understand how, if I'm someplace, I'm connected to something, how somebody might not be able to just look at some of my IPv6 addresses and just come directly to my single computer and get into it and all that. So we may get to that later. But we need to introduce Ben Ward, who's someone who I don't know, but Tim invited you. Ben, you want to say a couple of things about who you are, what you do, and your purpose for being, as they say?
Hi. Yeah, I'm currently running a consultancy called Love Hurts. I'm doing consultancy in the areas of TV white space, which is a new way of using television spectrum to communicate, and also Internet of Things is taking up most of my time. So yeah, interested to see how it fits in here. And when Tim says his fridge is talking to his solar panels, I don't think they'll be using VoIP, so I'm interested to know how that's going to work.
Okay, we have a problem that I need to address, which is that there's a whole bunch of bad video URLs around. So what I would like to do is turn it over to somebody else who can keep the ball rolling. And I'm trying to, you know who would be good for that? Because he's unmuted, is Dan York. Dan, why don't you start out and give you a little spiel on why we care about IPv6?
Well, partly to answer Ben's last question. Ben, yeah, this is the VoIP users conference, but we tend to take that in a kind of we have a wide latitude in what we cover, I should say, or a wide range of topics. So we've had all sorts of different sessions, and it's kind of whatever this particular group finds of interest. And if it's a VoIP connection, great. And in this show, I guess we're working in WebRTC, so we will have some VoIP parts of this. But
okay,
I think a lot of the interest in this particular show is IoT and how that all fits in. So, Randy, we had wanted us to, or had suggested we sort of talking a bit about IPv6 and sort of where that's come from since we last talked about it on the show, which was a while back. I don't remember the precise episode number where we did that, but if we're looking, and I put a link in the notes that the outline we started to prepare, but if we take a look at what's happened, is there's been a whole lot of IPv6 stuff, IPv6 evolution that's been happening over the last while, and the latest measurements, if you look at them from a couple of different sources, and I'm getting some feedback from somebody's line.
That's, I think, Love Hurts, the train.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, if you can mute, that would be great. If we look at some of the different statistics that are out there, for instance, Google's statistics that they have, where they've been tracking the amount of traffic coming to their various sites, it's growing. It's now become 4.5% of the traffic that they're seeing, which doesn't sound like much until you realize that really just a year ago it was down about 1%. and a year before that, it was down even less than that. So we've come all the way up to, in the space of just a couple of years, we've come up to, doubled, tripled the space that we have there. So the amount of traffic, and the curve is going very, very nicely in the direction that we want it to go as far as going up. And so we're seeing a lot of that at the Internet Society. We do a good bit of work. Part of our team there focuses around measurements of this. And if you recall back 2 years ago, there was the World IPv6 launch that happened on June 6th in 2012. And there's a series of measurements there that are being done on a monthly basis that are out there. And the latest numbers that we just talked about this past week that came out show that we're seeing some dramatic growth in some of the networks. For instance, here in the United States, where I'm at, we have Verizon Wireless showing about 56% IPv6 deployment across the traffic. The measurements of how much IPv6 is on their network is doing that, and really what's driving that a lot. And so, Ben, here's another telecom connection. Really, is the fact that all of the LTE, the long-term evolution, the new 4G, the networks that Verizon is doing, all of that is over IPv6. Or I should say it's IPv6 capable. It's all native IPv6 in that environment. So when I'm browsing on my mobile phone and I'm going to places that are IPv6 capable, such as all of Google's websites, all of Facebook, Wikipedia, Netflix, any of those sites, all are doing all the connectivity over IPv6. And so this phone is doing all of that natively there. So we've seen 56% deployment across Verizon Wireless network. TMoL just came up to about 40% here in the US, AT&T 24%, a number of other different statistics going on there. So we're seeing this momentum that's happening across there. And so that's a good bit of sort of what's going on as far as why why people are starting to talk about it a bit more than they were before. Now, along with that, we're seeing a good number of applications and networks and other pieces start to support that. Where we get into, and Randy, I know you had the question at one point, why should I care with making my website available over IPv6 or something like that? Part of the reality is there's only about 2.5–3 billion people who are online right now. There's the other 5 billion people that will be wanting to come on, that are looking to come on. We're out of IP addresses for those spaces unless we start to get into multiple layers of carrier grade NAT with IPv4, and then that creates a host of issues which we could talk about here if we want to at some point. But the reality is the business case is not so much what does IPv6 bring, but what's the reality of where IPv4 is going. There's a great webinar just this past week that, or actually I guess it was last week, that the Consumer Electronics Association, the CEA, they did a session that had Jason Brzezowski from Comcast. It had Leslie Daigle, who used to work at the Internet Society and now is on her own. It had Vince Cerf and Jason Fessler from Yahoo. And they were talking about, just the incredible growth and the need for it. And if you think about the venue, this is the Consumer Electronics Association, CEA, who is looking at a lot of these embedded devices and the pieces that we're talking about here. And when you get to talk about Internet of Things, many of those vendors are the providers of that. And so there's this recognition that this needs to happen. On that show, Vince Cerf was talking a good bit about what Google is doing with the Nest, the thermometers that they have and the other pieces of that. And they, along with Samsung, ARM, and a number of other companies, have they've come up with a new standard that they call Thread, which is it's a low power mesh network that all uses what's called 6LoWPAN. It's some technologies that do this, that do all of this Internet of Things, the IoT connectivity over IPv6. And you can learn more about that at threadgroup.org, but we could talk a bit about that in here. They're not alone. The Zigbee Alliance, which is another organization of people working on protocols for low power and lossy networks, these type of Internet of Things, they also now support IPv6 in their network. So the linkage is quite strong between what we're seeing in the IPv6 side and the need for that out there and what's happening in the Internet of Things world. So that's kind of the precursor to that. And I guess what I'd throw it out is to maybe to Tim or to Ben, as far as the work you're doing within the Internet of Things area. Has IPv6 factored at all into what you're looking at?
So Ben, go for it. I've got a question I'm going to ask Dan in a minute, but
it's supposed to be, is the answer I've got. It's the thing that will save us all. In the meantime, trying to find the hardware that operates on 6LoWPAN is actually quite difficult to do. It does exist, and it tends to exist in its own world. I would be happy to move across to it. I'd be happy to be using 6LoWPAN gateways and co-op and anything else I could. Although, to be honest, the things that run on batteries don't actually use IP at all. And it's trying to move that out to the edges where they're battery powered. That's where I think I'm really interested in it working.
Cool. Yeah, and that's actually been one of the challenges I think a number of people have said. Is the availability of the devices that fully support that. And I think that's a large part of what Google, Samsung, ARM, et cetera, are trying to do with this new group, is to help to try to get those devices out there so they could be able to make use of that. I had a friend of mine who's doing a lot of stuff with IoT right now, and I asked him about, well, does it work with IPv6? Naturally, was my question. I said, well, hey, it's a good thing. What are you doing? And he said, well, I don't know. And then he went and looked, and he was running a lot of his startups stuff up in Amazon's EC2 clouds, and they're not fully supportive of IPv6 yet. So he was not able to go and do that. But certainly he's aware of that. Looking, I see Tim trying to hold up something. So what do you got?
Yeah, so to Ben's point, this is I don't know if you can all see it, but that's a radio frequency chip that's actually on an Arduino Shield. So you can see there's a very small stamp size module that's mounted on an Arduino Shield, and that's exactly for this kind of purpose. It's for remote data collection. But when you look at it, actually the protocol that runs is effectively a serial port. It's a kind of network serial port with some security on top of it, and that, yeah, Ben's actually got a much better example. That will measure how far away your water is. And we can talk about that in a second. But my point was that actually what you find is that when you get to the Internet of Things, instead of going forward in a protocol towards IPv6 and LoWPAN, what you find is that people are going backwards. The practical stuff is all going backwards to serial protocols. This thing, the other end of this, which I've temporarily lost, is a USB stick that plugs into my computer and looks like a serial port. So I can run TIP and CU, and in theory, I could run UUCP over it or SLIP, and we're going back 15 years. And I look at that and I think, I don't know, am I happy about that or not? But the trick is that you can run that off a 9-volt battery for a year or something, whereas good luck with running
a full-blown IP stack and everything else.
Right, exactly. So Ben, show us your water monitor. I think that's.
I just wanted to point out there's been a recent announcement. A company called 1248.io. They are founded by Pilgrim Beert, who also did Alert Me and one or two other things. They've come up with a gateway that does 6LoWPAN and is intended to kind of 6LoWPAN up your enterprise, if you like, and start to get devices onto your network. They just around the same time, ARM have come up with the Embed OS, which is intended to run on what they call resource-constrained devices. So that will actually help you to run this battery-powered 6LoWPAN device. Obviously, that's vaporware at the moment, but it's I think it's going to be in alpha by the end of the year. So that's I think people have been listening, and it's coming. So the main issue with the serial stuff is that you have to write everything from scratch, and you have to write everything that maintains the whole operating system, because you're writing an operating system, and that's a headache. When you just want to put your fridge on the internet, then you don't really care about that. You care about the next layer up, if you like, or at least 4 layers above that. Unfortunately, in the meantime, this is what we've had to build, which is, I'm trying to find a good way of showing this. All right, a piece of paper with me. So what you've got there is an ultrasonic rangefinder and an external antenna and a temperature sensor in the front somewhere around there. You put that under a bridge or somewhere, and it will monitor the water level as it rises, and that will be your very cheap simple flood detection system. So at the other end there is a equivalent radio, which could be one of the USB sticks that Tim described, or perhaps one of these, which is on a short Ethernet cable, so I can't show you. Raspberry Pi running that. It would be nice to go straight to the device, to the internet, but yeah, we've got to start somewhere. So that's where we've been at the moment, is building these devices. They're based on Arduino microcontrollers, and to be honest, the first problem you have to solve is how do you attach a thing to another thing, to a bridge? How do you climb on a bridge? How do you get permission to do it? Do you need permission to do it? That kind of stuff. So there's a whole load of challenges with the Internet of Things. It's unfortunately involves duck shit.
Well, to that point, you ask about the whole point about security, and how are you working with that in the environments you're in? As far as, or in the case of flood sensors, do you care who gains access to it?
We don't actually, because it's on the other hand, if they were listening, and they don't go into listening mode, but if they were listening, they wouldn't have any protection. So the only thing you could do is potentially spoof the flood levels and panic everyone, I suppose. So for the time being, it's okay as it is. Given the choice of letting someone else manage all the encryption and authentication and having to do it ourselves, I think I'd rather let someone else manage it and use their operating system.
Mentioning encryption makes me want to ask a question, and apparently I don't have the. Here we go.
You don't have video, Randy.
I'm looking for it. It's called, here it is. The question being, that's a good point. Who's responsible for what here? And so, part A of the question: should devices? And I think Ben just said the opposite of this. Devices be doing encryption, or is that too heavy for them? Probably yes. So somebody's got to do encryption, because otherwise everybody knows what the temperature is in your house and all kinds of other things, like they could download records and so on. And the other thing is, and this is a much more basic question about IPv6, guys. So I've got a set-top box. Our internet provider is quadruple play, so they just provide. I don't have a router. They've got this box, and it does routing, and it happens to have a checkbox, and you check IPv6. It may have even been the default, and then that's over, and you got IPv6. I don't know anything about it or what goes on behind it, and my question isn't about me, but it's about the average person. So, in the U.S., for example, who's the biggie? Comcast? Does Comcast do IPv6 on all their boxes? Some of their boxes? How is that being pushed out, first of all? And
sure. So,
the real world, in other words, of boxes.
So Comcast has rolled out IPv6 to all of their residential network and into their business as well. And it has been a process over the past several years of updating the CPE, the customer premise equipment, the cable modems, et cetera. And in most cases, it's been an issue of just updating the software. I imagine in some cases they might have had to send out new home cable modems, et cetera. But it's a CPE process on one part. I have Time Warner cable where I'm at in Keene, New Hampshire, and getting the process of getting native IPv6, which I do have, was a process where they had to make sure that my cable modem would support it, and then they had to go and change, do a software upgrade. But that was it. Once it was there, it then came in. Now, on the inside of that cable modem, it does matter what are you doing. Now, in case, in my case, I run my own server gateway. I'm enough of a geek that I like to do that kind of stuff. So I needed to choose one that was using IPv6 or would support it, and so I do that. In the case of a lot of the consumer vendors, like Comcast, the residential providers, very often most of the customers are using the box that Comcast provides. So it's the home router, it's the Wi-Fi router, it does all of that. It's got some kind of firewall in there, all typically being managed by Comcast in some way, that they're able to go and do. And so that's what that's how they've managed it. And now John Jason Brzezowski will tell you that when they turn up homes, what they find is that typically in a short period of time, about 40% of the traffic that they see coming out of that home winds up being IPv6, largely because most every smartphone these days supports IPv6 over a Wi-Fi network. Most every laptop and everything else supports IPv6. And a lot of the sites that people want to go to, again, the Google properties, Facebook, Wikipedia, all those kinds of Netflix, all of that stuff is IPv6. So they found it quite interesting that once they enable it for a home, about 40% of the traffic that they get out of there is all IPv6. But you shouldn't have to do much.
So I have a question. I have two questions for that.
Sure.
On that one, Dan. So I've got IPv6 natively from my ISP, and it comes into the house. And actually, for all I know, this particular video call might be over IPv6. I don't know if the gateway is enabled IPv6, but I don't know. Anyway,
No, it's not.
Okay, well,
Why not?
but leaving the email baiting aside,
We support it. It's just the machine doesn't have IPv6.
okay. So but what happens then is also on my network to cover other rooms in the house, I have a Apple Airport Extreme,
Right.
and when I put that on my Ethernet network here, which is IPv6, it doesn't seem to want to pass the IPv6 goodness onto its Wi-Fi clients. So I have a hardwired IPv6 which doesn't get onto my Wi-Fi, and I spend the odd half hour trying to fix that, and I've never managed to do it, and I kind of shrugged and gave up. And then the corollary question, just very briefly, is when you say that properties like Facebook and Google are IPv6 enabled, for Facebook, don't you have to have use a different URL, or does it work it out from DNS?
So let me answer both. The first question on the Apple Extreme, Airport Extreme, that's just a configuration issue because that's what I'm using in my home network. And you just have to go into the airport utility, and there's a little box in there about something with IPv6.
And then it asked me questions I didn't know the answer to.
Well, that may be an issue as far as making it easy to go and do that. And maybe you'll give me a topic for another blog post to write up. But
cool.
But it works because that's what I'm using here. So my smartphone, my devices are all connecting in through an Apple Extreme, and the Apple access point has been super easy with making IPv6 work. It's been really great that way, and it just cascades it out there, and so you're able to go and work with that. On the second question, before World IPv6 launch in 2012, many of the sites did stand up IPv6 on a separate URL. But the whole point of World IPv6 launch in June of 2012 was that these major sites turned on IPv6 on their main URL and just set it up, and boom, it was done. So you just go to Facebook, you go to Google, you go to any of the Google properties, you go to Microsoft Bing, you go to Wikipedia, all of those you connect in. There's actually a very cool extension for Chrome called IPv4, and there's one for Firefox called IPv6, which was actually the original one, which puts a little icon up in your address bar that shows you whether it's going whether your connection is over IPv4 or IPv6. So that's how I knew that, for instance, this connection was not going over V6 because I can just go right up there and click on it.
Oh, but you don't know that whether the media is.
What?
You don't know whether the media is going over V6. You
Well,
could browse to the site by V4 and then have the media run over V6.
Correct. So this IPv4 thing only shows you that. Now, what shows you the site that you're hitting, so the main URL. So I know if I'm hitting that, it will drop down. Like in this case, I can see that Emil, there's a connection to jitsi.vuc.me. There's a connection to netdna.bootstrapcdn.com. Both those are IPv4. And there's a connection to www.googleanalytics.com, which is over IPv6. So that connection is happening there. Now, the interesting aspect when you talk about Facebook, Facebook now does have a separate URL. They brought it back. You can now go to www.v6.facebook.com, and that hits their IPv6 only data site. So they're running in an IPv6 only data center. And so they made that available for all of the V6 geeks who want to go and play with a direct native, never fall back to V4 kind of connection.
I think there's an interesting parentheses I need to open here. It's happening in IRC. Fred and JHA are talking about this, and it's just resolves to a simple question, which is, so he said you can have private IPv6 addresses because Fred says, I don't want my camera at the bakery to have a public IP address. And that's right. I mean, I totally get that. That's one of my fears. So how do you separate public and private IPv6 addresses?
Sure. So, well, there's a couple answers to that. First of all, the whole idea of IPv6 was that you could be able to have connections out there without the need to go through a NAT box. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean you don't have a firewall. I have a very solid firewall on the edge of my network. It just means that I'm not adding the extra step of doing the NAT conversion on the edge of things, of translating the addresses from a public to a private. So I still have firewall rules. I still have all of this. Now, the other aspect is that almost every device today uses something called IPv6 privacy addresses, which is where what it does is the device generates an IPv6 address that's a temporary, it's a hash. It's a random address within the space. And it uses that for a certain period of time, and then it regenerates a new one. My Apple devices or other devices generate a new privacy address actually every day. They generate a new IPv6 address every day. This is when, it's wild when we think about it in the IPv4 context, but we've moved from a world of scarcity to a world of abundance when it comes to addressing. And so we have flexibility to go and do this because you don't want, one of the strengths of IPv6 when it first came out was this idea that it would get the host, the network portion, and connect it to the MAC address of your device. And you have this very easy way to create an IPv6 address. The problem was exactly what Fred and others are talking about in there. They don't want to be tracked. And you could know this device as it roamed across various networks. If the MAC address was always being used, you could start to track where the device was as it went across that. So because of that, pretty much every IPv6 operating system has moved to supporting these privacy addresses, which go and do that. Now, there also is separately something called unique local addresses, or ULAs or ULAs, which is a mechanism of doing something akin to what we're used to in the world of RFC 1918, in the world of IPv4, where you can have a separate IP address realm. You can do that. There are some places that do that in some ways, but so it is out there. That is part of the toolbox that you do have.
So I think what that tells me is that IPv6 solves some of the problems that Ben is hoping to solve, but actually not all of them by any means. In terms of how do I address my flood monitor? Well, if it's rotating its IP address every time it switches on, which, if I remember rightly, it only powers up like 10% of the time or something. So it'll have a different IPv6 address every time it cycles. And then that means, how do I talk to it?
That's your choice. You could decide that you want to just give it a fixed address, and we're done.
Okay.
Well, that brings up a good question, and Ben might be the person to answer this or address it, which is that in general, these, because I totally know nothing about this model, the paradigm of Internet of Things, so-called. So you've got your refrigerator or your thermostat or whatever it is, some device out there. If this was all wired, there would probably be a polling of some kind going on, right? But because this is going to be over the internet, I mean, what exactly is the paradigm here? Is your thermostat being called by something, or is it calling out to something? What are the typical models involved there?
Yeah, there's a couple of models. I think they do often depend on battery life. So the model for me is the thing that's always listening is on mains power, and that will need constantly to be listening, so it's going to need to be powered, and then the device that's actually doing the data collection will wake up, send, so you have to be listening, and then go back to sleep. An alternative is actually to set up an interval that you're going to talk to each other at. So you agree to rendezvous in the near future, and then you're both listening. But you do have to get your timing right for that to work. I suppose you can have various mechanisms to keep that window open long enough to listen for communications. I mean, I was watching something about Voyager 2 last night, the Voyager space probes, and it's essentially the Internet of Things. It's really, you need to communicate with a thing that you have no control over anymore, and it will cost you more than the device is worth, and probably more than the contract is worth, to go and fiddle with it. So on one hand, you want this remote management capability. On the other hand, that costs you in terms of complexity, it costs you in terms of listening and battery life. So, there are probably an infinite number of approaches to it, but certainly having the devices that are constrained, giving you the information, that's important. Excuse the Friday night.
They're not coming for you, hopefully.
No, there's an accident on that road every day, so it's just normal. Don't come to Oxford by car. One more thing.
Go ahead, Ben. I'm sorry.
Just one point that I wanted to raise about the IPv6. I have to NAT out of people's broadband. So this is a community project where people use their broadband to allow us to send data, which is great. But if we want to manage those devices, we have no way of getting through the NAT without getting onto their router and fiddling around with port forwarding, and they're not going to like that, and they probably don't even know how, and they wouldn't want us sitting there doing that. So I've had to make a VPN out of the device, out of the gateway device, to a rendezvous point, so that we can get back in and update the software on these gateways. And that's the same for if you want to use an app on your phone to view the temperature in your house, something like that has to happen. You have to have this rendezvous point where the viewer looks at data that's pushed out to the internet. IPv6 lets you actually go straight to the devices. Whether you allow that or not, that's completely up to you.
Right, and that's the point, because somebody's firewall rules have to allow those kind of connections through that firewall still. So even in an IPv6 world, you might still find yourself needing to do that VPN back to some kind of rendezvous point, purely to bypass the firewall rules that the folks may have, depending on how much configuration they'll allow or what they'll let you do.
Or you can use iStun and turn.
Correct.
Something just occurred to me. I always have to preface these things with, I may be really stupid, but I don't know. Is there any logic towards having a centralized thing that's connected to the power and that talks to this stuff like a subnet, and then it deals with the real world somehow? I mean, maybe like a PBX, but for but things? Does that make any sense, or is it already being?
Isn't that how Philips Hue works, actually? That's sounds pretty much like it.
Yeah, I think that is the model, pretty much. I mean, I think it was Ben was just in Ben's thing. He puts a Raspberry Pi directly connected to somebody's router, and the Pi has a short-range serial radio which talks to the thing under the bridge. So so that is the model. But the thing is that
at least 2 gateways in my hand that do exactly this job, and there's another 3 in the house somewhere.
But that's kind of my point, that there are now there's more of them, and they're not all necessarily going to be connected on the same LAN. So if you then want to have them talk amongst themselves, you've got a meta problem, which is, you know, how do they reach each other? And I think that's an interesting problem, and one that I'm actually thinking of trying to get some European money to try and solve, because I think it's interesting. I think it's needed, and what's more, I think that some of the stuff that we did for WebRTC would let us solve it, and I think that's my current kind of background research interest is whether some of the WebRTC techniques are things that we can apply to the Internet of Things. Probably not all the way out to the sensors because it's too heavy, but out to the Pis and the things that are sitting in the fridges and whatever. And I should say, Randy asked me when we were setting this call up, he said, well, why does my fridge want to talk to my heating system anyway? And actually there's a really good reason, which is if they both knew about each other, then your fridge could say, hey, listen, I'm about to dump a kilowatt hour of energy into the kitchen because I'm just about to do a cooling cycle. And if you tell the heating system that, the heating system could hold off on running that radiator for another hour probably, rather than them both kicking in at the same time and the fridge running inefficiently and the kitchen getting hotter than it needed to. So there's actually a huge potential energy savings in being smarter at the timing of these things by using information from the other sensors or the other capabilities. And the other thing that happened to me last week, I don't know how I blagged this, but I got an invite to a workshop that's run by the EU about the future of big data, actually. I have no idea why they invited me, a mistake, I think. But anyway, but what was fascinating is that the big data guys outside the financial community, the big data guys are all now coming to the realization that their data models are entirely dependent on having a plethora of Internet of Things devices feeding them. And then even once they know the answers to, where is my traffic or where's the power consumption going, they then have to try and actuate something with the result, which is another bunch of Internet of Things devices, like, changing the traffic lights or redirecting whatever it is, power down different lines or whatever. So what you find is that they've suddenly realized that all of this big data research they've done is useless until they've got an Internet of Things network that they can use to feed it and, actuate the results from. So that was fascinating, the kind of collapsing of the problem back to, how do we make the Internet of Things work? And I'm increasingly interested in those problems, and I think why this ties back to this community, I think that the stuff that the VoIP world has learnt about how do you make peer-to-peer connections securely, we finally got around to it over the last year or two. We finally got that working. I think there's a lot to teach the Internet of Things world about how that can work. And as you say, Randy, the kind of PBX analogy is also interesting. So that's my rant.
You're right. And I think the reason we're interested in this stuff is that the idea of, VoIP is like MIDI for music was, 20 years ago? I don't know. These are just ways to get sessions going and so on. SIP, anyway, ways to get sessions going. WebRTC has its own whole language that you guys know a lot about, but it's all really the same thing, is like, how can I talk to this thing? So IoT really boils down also to the same thing. But what you just said is interesting because the fridge telling the heating system, hey, I'm about to let huge gaseous emission that is going to heat in so many kilowatt hours, that's going to why combat, in other words. That's okay, got that. Next question is regarding big data is, would it be beneficial for people to be able to opt into things like agreeing to show your furnace's energy pattern, blah, 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 and the entire area, the region, collects all this stuff anonymously, I'm doing air quotes, and is able to build all this stuff up. Certainly for humanity, that would be great, and the absolute, objective viewpoint, but there's going to be big problems with the idea of privacy and how that stuff's going to be used and so on, for better or worse.
So the joy of this meeting, where there was somebody from the European Commission there as well, was that they're aware of this stuff, which is glorious. I mean, she was saying, well, we need to do this in a European way, which respects individual privacy. And in brackets, not actually saying this, and that's different from the American way. And we can't allow our kind of social values to be overridden by those of Silicon Valley without us making a decision about it, which I thought was fascinating. And it was a very interesting kind of, and the Commission appear, for the moment at least, to be prepared to put some money behind that idea. And what came out around the table, which I thought was fascinating, was the idea that you could license your data. So you'd actually earn money by licensing your data, and you could revoke the license on your data. And I saw some figures, I did a little research afterwards, and your data is worth, just the data you put into Facebook is worth about 150 quid. So, the knowledge of when you move house or what holiday you took or whatever is actually worth significant amounts of money, even now, with the simplistic data and the poor correlation that Facebook does with it. It's worth significant money. But they are talking about, theoretically at least, about nested licensing models, so that you can kind of like Creative Commons or something, but on your data. And as it goes up the aggregation tree, people can buy it and you get some money back for it. Now, exactly how that's going to work, nobody knows, but the Commission appears to be prepared to put money into finding out, which is, I think it's, well, it needs doing. Whether it's needs doing by bureaucrats, I don't know, but that's, somebody's got to do it.
Well, if Great Britain doesn't opt out of the EU before the next few months, we'll see what happens.
Yeah. I'm. You've got a spare bed, haven't you, there, Randy? I can. If we leave the EU, I may be looking for somewhere else to live.
Anytime. Has anybody else? There's this huge thing raging on IRC, and it's impossible to relate the whole thing. But if you're,
I should read it.
If you don't know about IRC and you're listening to my voice, go to vuc.me/IRC, log in, and you'll be able to read it, because there's a lot of very, very interesting stuff. Dan York is one of these guys, like John Todd was, who can type and talk and think and be looking at other URLs at the same time. So he's in it, but he's not talking. Some of these, there are like, I know about 5 people out of hundreds who can actually be talking. He wasn't, but he's going to in a second. But Dan was going on in this thing, and he's saying intelligent stuff. And now I'm going to let him say something else intelligent right now. What are you looking here, folks? Anything? So type in IRC or use in ZipDX while Dan is telling his point of view.
Okay, so no, we were just having a conversation about addressing over in the IPv6 addressing in the chat. Following up on the conversation, you started to say here about the private versus public and what you could do and pieces around that. So I was just providing some links to where you can find out more about what's the unique local addresses, but also just the point about addressing plans and some of the pieces. And I was also pointing out there's a new release of the OpenWRT software that many people run on their access points that was released on September 30th. It was a new barrier breaker, or part of that release anyway, that had a whole bunch of more IPv6 goodness. So that's all. It wasn't really a huge thing, but just having that conversation in the side channel.
Okay. Again, anybody have anything they want to say into IRC or ZipDX? Let's see if ZipDX hits *6 unmute yourself and we are still connected to ZipTX.
Yeah, from the IRC channel, I could say one of the things that about.
I don't see it. Are we connected? Yes. Okay. Anybody on ZipTX have anything to say?
Oh,
quite quiet. Well, you know who else is quiet is Emil.
Actually, Internet of Things has been a very a subject that I've been following completely from the outside. I am actually we have a very good relationship with the network research team at the University of Strasbourg, and they do a lot of work there on all levels on routing, low power protocols, and all that. And so I do think it's a fascinating subject. I do regret a little bit that there's not much that one can do combining things like video conferencing and Internet of Things, at least not today in a meaningful way. But obviously you could maybe think of some of those things for the future. Well, yeah. But one of the things that I've been wondering is this IPv6 thing that we came up with, it's 20 years ago, right? Something like that. It just doesn't seem to fit anywhere, right? Because, and let me be clear, I very much like IPv6. I deploy it whenever I can. I use it whenever I can, except on the VUC.me server. That was just a matter of honor. And we're going to make that happen next time. Actually, we're having a problem with the OVH addressing in our virtual machines, but we're going to find a solution. So anyways, coming back to it, IPv6 came out, and it wasn't adopted. And it's now taking a lot of education, a lot of effort, a lot of motivation, lots of it similar to global warming, education. And you have to be facing a disaster, basically, in order to go and do the work that's required to switch to IPv6. Obviously, the reasons for that are that installing IPv6 requires some amount of effort, and we can argue all day long whether or not this effort is significant or not. But it does require non-trivial effort, and people are obviously going to use solutions to their problems that require less effort if those exist, and they do exist. Those have been mapped so far. And now looking at an Internet of Things, we have exactly the same situation. The whole point when IPv6 was being started was, one day we're going to have billions of devices, so how are you going to solve that? There, you have IPv6 now. And then we're actually entering the stage of our development when we do have billions of devices. It turns out that IPv6 doesn't solve that problem, and you have to come up with those bridged protocols and low power versions and things that aren't actually IPv6. So I hope that one day we can make it, we can stitch the whole thing together. But do you guys feel that we messed up something with IPv6? Where did it go wrong? What are the assumptions that we made that weren't right? Like, for example, were we thinking because IPv6 was still in the early days of internet in the late 90s, it was still imaginable? I mean, it was still manageable. You could still talk to all the people who were running the big networks and make them do stuff. Was that it? Was that made the protocol a little bit naive in terms of, people will just upgrade, sure, no problem. I mean, what do you think about that?
So I could go on for an hour on that topic, but I actually have to drop off fairly soon. But the reality, Emil, is what you said, is people don't respond very well until there's a kind of emergency and until there's some kind of thing. And unfortunately, a lot of time, I think, was spent with IPv6 talking about we're running out of IPv4 addresses, And the reality is we kept finding ways to squeeze more IPv4 addresses out and more availability out there. And so we've got to the point where we are today where we kept on, part of it is people who are advocates for IPv6 kept on saying, it's the end is coming, the end is near. And sooner or later, people started to say, well, they got tired of hearing that. The reality is that now the end is near. APNIC and Right in Europe both have run out of IPv4 addresses to give out to people. They're in the Well, they're in the final allocations. So they're getting very close to having just no more addresses. And so when new people want to go and bring a new wireless network on or do something like that, there just aren't the addresses they can get.
I absolutely agree with that, actually, and I see that people now we're going up to 4%, as you said in the beginning. So yes, finally it's beginning to take. But why? I mean, when the iPhone came out, because you said people don't like switching to new things, they aren't very reactive to that. But when the iPhone came out, everyone switched to it. When smartphones came out, everyone switched to those. When Gmail came out, everyone switched to that. When Gmaps came out, everyone switched to that. So,
but Emil, think about each of those devices.
Advantage, right?
Each of those devices provided something new and better. You know, we switched to smartphones because they got us so much more capability. We switched to Gmail because it was so much quicker and better than that. The sad reality is IPv6 to a consumer level, to somebody on the basic level, doesn't really provide a whole lot of, great incentive to go and switch to it.
And there are two ways you can fix that problem, right? One is to make it provide something new, and the other is to make it so frictionless to update to that, the delta between the two, the benefits, you don't have enough benefits, but then you make your friction really low. So you still can convince people. But here we had somewhat high friction and very low benefits. And
Exactly. And that's been part of the challenge that's come on so long. And now, here in 2014, we have both sides are happening. On the one hand, we've got a lot of the issue is very real now that we can't, in many parts of the world. Now, Africa has still a large blocks of IPv4 addresses in Afrinic. North America is getting shorter, but there's a lot hold up, and ISPs have a lot of in their pool, so it'll be a little while on that. But we're coming up to that, but at the same time, we're having more and more devices that now have IPv6 capabilities that work. Like I said, my smartphone and stuff just works. And most operating systems now have that, but it's taken a while for us to get to that point where the devices and the technology was there, so that the friction was much less to go and switch that on. All the homes that are on Comcast here in North America, they don't even know. I mean, the average consumer doesn't know they're going over IPv6, nor should they. They should just be able to go and connect to Facebook, connect to YouTube, do whatever they want to do.
What do you mean, nor should they? Everyone should know that they're using IPv6. Why else are we bothering them?
Why does it matter to my?
I think
matter to my mother if she's going to, YouTube to watch something over IPv4 or v6? She doesn't care.
Man, all the effort it took to deploy IPv6.
Yeah,
of course, they should know.
So I think
my wife wants to update Facebook. It shouldn't matter at all.
That wasn't a serious command, then. That was just.
Oh, okay.
But I actually think there is an interesting case where it may actually be worth, maybe perceptible to the end user and maybe worth doing. So if you look at two LTE users who are both on both trying to do a call over WebRTC, and they're both on the same carrier, so they're both on Verizon, I'd be really interested to see what happens, what route WebRTC takes. So classically, I guess, on most mobile networks, it'll end up taking a turn server out in the cloud, because most IPv4 addresses within a mobile network can't see either IPv4 addresses in the same mobile network. So my phone can't send a UDP packet to somebody else's phone that's on the same Vodafone network using the internal IP addresses on that network. So what I wonder is whether when all of our phones get given IPv6 addresses, then whether that that peer-to-peer call will end up going more directly.
Why would it matter? I mean, that's a policy decision. If they wanted to make that work, they could have made it work with their own addresses. Why?
Yeah, but they haven't.
Yeah, so why would they change that for IPv6?
Well, because they end up reusing the addresses. So there's absolutely no issue with the local cell handing out. I don't know how this works actually, but for example, there would be no problem with the local cell handing out a 192.168.1 address locally, and then doing the same to somebody else in a cell in Scotland, and handing out the same address, provided we all ended up NATing through a couple of layers of NAT out to a common gateway. They don't. Whereas with IPv6, you probably wouldn't do it that way. You'd generate unique IP addresses. So they might be able to talk to each other. I don't know. It's just a kind of idle thought.
Yeah, that's certainly part of it. And also another element is that, what you said in there, as people look at how they connect across the networks, what we're seeing is because of the IPv4 scarcity, we're seeing large telco carriers roll out what's, carrier grade NAT, CGN, which is basically you take your entire wampum ISP and you stick it behind a single IP address. And there's actually, a good number of networking vendors that will love to sell you large CGN boxes, which are basically big honking NAT boxes that take, thousands or tens of thousands of customers and put them all behind that single IP address. And now you're connecting out across there to go to somebody else's network. And now typically in a home environment, the home network in IPv4 is also running purely, they're running behind a NAT. So now you're throwing another layer of NAT in there. You start to get in there and you start to add, additional layers of latency and change that go in there. Some of the folks at Time Warner did some testing a bit ago and found that there was, a degree of difference when people were using things like Xbox or when they were using real-time communications going across, multiple layers of CGN. So there is this performance impact that comes in there. One of the interesting things to kind of go back to Emil's question, there's a gentleman named Dave Wilson who did a talk recently at a couple of RIPE conferences, et cetera. He talked about, where did we go wrong with IPv6? And I'd encourage you to take a look at it, Emil, because he asked some great questions and talks about that. And his suggestion really too is, look at, rather than trying to convert out some of the older places in different ways, look at where we can use IPv6 in more greenfield environments. Classic example of that is what we've said here, the mobile LTE environment. Rather than doing that over IPv4, that's all happening over IPv6, and it's all making a huge difference right there. Some of the other technologies that are happening that people are using to link back to environments, they're using IPv6 in different spaces in different places. So in my mind, some of where IoT can go, to bring it back to this topic around that, is look at how do we use IPv6 as an enabler of that? How do we get started with that? Because you wind up looking at what can you do to help with that. You look at places like Facebook that has moved their entire data centers to being all over IPv6. They've done that because they're looking at when IPv4 runs out, how are they going to have the most competitive advantage? And so they've gone to doing that for that purpose. So they'll be positioned to do that. It's all good questions, and I think it's, we could spend another episode talking about some of the reasons why, but I think the more important part is how do we move forward. I think the good news is we've got much more of the devices and applications and pieces. Some of these new, IoT software stacks provide the kind of IPv6 support I think that is needed to help people do that. Although it doesn't answer the question of what do you do in the truly low power environments. But like was mentioned here, there are groups such as 6LoWPAN. There's a couple of other IETF working groups that are working on this, low power and lossy environment that's there. So I think there have been challenges, and there's lots of there will be challenges. There will be plenty more. There's lots of opportunity as well as we look at how do we bring those next 5 billion people and their 5 billion, all their zillion little devices, right? It's another comment that we had on here that James Bodie's not on with us, but he's usually got 20 devices with him at any given time. We all want to connect those.
Hey. So I just want to thank Ben for he's gone, but I wanted to thank him for joining us. I knew that he had to leave. So cool. Anyway,
that was an inspiration, Tim. Thank you for that. I have a question. Can an individual ask for, or should there be a mechanism someday in the future for an individual to be able to ask for a block of IPv6 addresses, since there's so many of them? Or alternative question: how are these things assigned? Is it the same as IPv4 because there are so many more of them? How does my provider get their block, and how do they get it to me, and how do they decide what I get?
It's the same process as it was for IPv4. In that at the top of things, there's the Internet Assigned Names and Numbers Authority, IANA, which then passes out address blocks to the 5 regional internet registries, which would be RIPE NCC in Europe, where you are. It'd be ARIN here in North America, AFRINIC, LACNIC, and I'm spacing APNIC, of course. So the 5 of those, they then pass them out to the individual internet service providers. And then, depending upon the relationship, they might pass them on down to others. Eventually, somebody would give you an IP address out of a range like that.
These are that's a little bit like product codes. If you come out with a CD, because I've done this, there's one body, I